Hi there, this is Keith from Shipwright Skills, and we're going to make a cooler. So I had an idea to make a cooler that, worked and was functional, that looked, sort of like something out of a cartoon or a video game, or, just had kind of a fantasy look to it. So I did that, and we'll show you how we did it. So I designed first the cooler shape on the computer, and then I cut it out with my little CNC router here, Shaper Origin. Works great. Out of very thin Luan plywood. It's inexpensive and easy to work with. So I just sort of taped it together, made sure that it worked in the computer, and then sanded all the parts and prepped them for gluing together. So I reinforced the corners of the outside of the main box with wood, so that way if you smashed it on something and it did poke through the plywood, it might just be reinforced so it wouldn't actually crack the cooler or something like that. So I just glued them in with epoxy, all those little sticks, and then I put backing blocks for where I thought the hinges would locate, so screws would have something to attach to. And then I proceeded with the rest. So here I'm filleting the inside of the ice box part of the cooler, which basically just used a round-ended stick and epoxy that has a filleting blend in it, fillers. And you just kind of want to do as clean a job as you can. It's not a perfect situation, but you can get it pretty good. This part will never be seen again. It'll be sealed inside, but I wanted that little cove shape on the inside for strength. So there I'm just sanding the corners down on the outside of the cooler body, so that way the fiberglass will wrap around it. At the same time, I'm sort of jumping back and forth. Here I'm prepping the lid. The lid has sort of a couple of skeleton forms inside of it, and then a couple of ends, and then I wrapped the bent plywood around it. So in order to hold those little skeleton ribs in there, I used 4-minute epoxy by TotalBoat. Works great for just quick holding things together, and you can use it for anything you want, but I used it for that. And then I backed it up with the real epoxy when I went to glue the whole thing together. So this is a High Performance Epoxy and fast hardener that I'm using. I like to meter with the pumps that way, so that way I don't ever forget a pump. You go, resin hardener, resin hardener, resin hardener, always that way. Then I'm adding silica to it to make it thicker and stronger. It also will, it's a little bit thin, so it'll absorb into the wood a bit, but it won't just fall off. I applied it to all the surfaces that were going to make contact with this bending plywood, temporarily duct taped it on just so I could get it held there till I could get a clamp on it. Once I got it all clamped up, I took the tape off and kind of wiped it up just to clean it up how I wanted it, and sanded it. And now we're on to glassing. So the glass is easy. It's just this maybe 6-ounce glass, I think. So I kind of wanted it tough, but I didn't want it to be too heavy. There I'm just pouring High Performance Epoxy again onto it. Moving it around with a yellow trowel and a chip brush, so you can kind of sit the glass down onto the wood as tight as you can, so you don't have air bubbles or any fiberglass floating around. There I'm cutting the hardened epoxy and fiberglass off with a razor blade so it's clean. And then the next step is to fill the weave of anything that you fiberglass with more clear epoxy. This is just more High Performance Epoxy mixed up and put on with no fillers. And I'm just filling all the fiberglass weave in, so that way later when I go to paint it, I'm just painting on a smooth surface. So here's the lid, a little bit more tricky because it's curved rather than flat. Hard to deal with, but not that bad. I just used the brush to stretch it around. The brush just is kind of gentle and soft, so it doesn't grab the glass like the yellow squeegee does. And then I used the squeegee, once it was all smooshed down onto the wood nicely, to take off any excess epoxy, so I wouldn't have, runs and stuff. That is a roller brush made from cutting a foam roller up and hot gluing it to a stick. Works great. It's a very low nap brush. So here I'm just going after those pleats with a razor blade before the epoxy cured, and then I was able to smush those little pleats down by cutting a dart into each pleat. I'll do the exact same thing again here, where I'm putting a little end cap of fiberglass on. I'll just smush it right over the edge with the brush, and then anywhere that there's a pleat, I'll cut a dart, and then they'll just overlap. This way I get, 2 layers of fiberglass on all the corners of this box and the lid and all that, so it should be pretty durable. But see, I'm not really fussing about how that glass sits down on the top, also because I'm going to cover it with a piece of trim later anyway. But you got to kind of work it and take your time, and then once all your parts are prepped, double check that you put your blocks in for hinges and handles and stuff like that, and then think about foam. This is the 2-part flotation foam. I think it's 6 pound, something like that. And it's dense. It's pretty darn dense. So it expands, as you can see, maybe 4 times its size, maybe 6. I don't know. It's very hard and strong and waterproof. So there, I just taped an extra rim onto the top of my the icebox part, I'm calling it. So that way I would be able to locate the height of the icebox inside of the main cooler body. I mix small batches of this foam because it expands like crazy, and you don't want it to do something that you don't want it to do. So here I was able to just locate the box inside the other box. That's after the first pour. It filled up, and it basically glued the inner box into the outer box nicely. So I know it won't go anywhere now, and I can just kind of proceed with filling with foam. So I did small batches of the foam because I didn't want to have any air gaps. I wanted this cooler to actually work and be as hard and tough and dense as possible. So I'm using this high density foam and just making sure everything's mixed well and taking my time, but you can't take that much time because you only have like maybe 30 seconds, probably less, to get it in there. And then I'm just, working it around, just making sure it evenly fills up the inside of that cooler. At the same time, I'm working on the lid in the background. You can kind of see it under my armpit there. I've got the inner part of the lid weighted down with a couple of jugs of epoxy just to make sure that it doesn't float out of the lid when I fill it with foam. But while one piece is curing, like while the cooler's curing, then I jump over, pour a batch into the lid, and then I'll jump back over and pour a batch into the cooler. The cooler maybe took 6 pours maybe, and the top only took maybe 2 or 3 maybe. I'm using separate cups to pour into and to mix into. So I sort of pour the right size batch into each cup, and then I pour both cups into a mixing cup. And that seemed to be a good technique. I like to do it when I'm doing batch epoxy and all that kind of stuff. Less chance of messing something up. So there, I'm just filling up that lid while the cooler box is doing its thing. And it gives off quite a bit of heat, actually. So I'm just checking the heat, just making sure nothing weird is happening, watching it bubble. It's like better than watching paint dry, though. So after it blows up and it's hard, you can saw off the excess. I just used a Japanese saw, it worked well. And then a little bit of sandpaper, pretty rough sandpaper to get all that goop off before you want to paint it. So then I put that temporary rim back on, glued it down, and now I'm fiberglassing over the top part of the cooler body. So now I'll have 2 layers of fiberglass on all the corners up there as well. So it should be nice and tough. I'm just, anywhere I meet a place where the glass doesn't want to bend, I just cut it with a razor blade or a knife or the electric shears or any of that kind of stuff. It all works. The fiberglass cuts pretty easy. So you just want to make sure you stay with it and let the glass sit down against the material. If you just throw it down and then walk away, I guarantee that glass is going to lift up and you'll have problems. So you want to just kind of stay with it until it's starting to gel. And then it'll stay down. But you want to make sure that glass doesn't have a big air bubble underneath it that you're going to end up sanding through and ruining. So that's just the little end lap. Yeah, keep those shears clean. I like to use alcohol. You can use acetone as well. They both work on epoxy. So at this point, I'm adding those little trim pieces to the cooler body. And I'm just using tape mainly to hold them on. And I've mixed the epoxy pretty much just like I did before for construction with just silica. You know, not too thick that it won't soak into the wood, but not too thin that it just flops off. So if you just do that, then you can tape your pieces on. You don't have to squish them like you're using Tight Bond or something. So you just, you know, tape it on, you know, take your time, and anywhere that there's a little gap, that glue will fill. So you don't have to have it sitting super tight and flat and perfect. This isn't that kind of project. I just kept it simple. Anywhere that there was, you know, some squeeze out, you can see some significant squeeze out there, I just scraped it off because I am going to go with another coat of epoxy next, but you want to make sure it's not too much sanding. So yeah, I kind of sanded it up, prepped it, ready for the next coat of epoxy. Kind of fill it all in. The grain of all my little trim pieces needs to be filled. It doesn't have any fiberglass like the main box does, so you want to make sure it all paints out nicely. So here I'm just adding dispersion pigment from TotalBoat to the epoxy. It's pretty opaque, this stuff, and I'm kind of filling my wood grain. I'm filling up any little last air bubbles or, you know, any of the weave of the fiberglass or anything. I'm doing it with epoxy that has pigment in it, so it's sort of like a primer. The epoxy is way tougher than paint, so it's kind of nice to have an extra little bit on the surface to protect the piece, and then it'll all paint out similar. But I'm using gray in the epoxy so that we don't have to hide the wood grain with the paint. I'll let the paint do the paint, and I'll let this be the colored primer. Also, then, if you sand through your paint, you'll start to see this gray, and you can kind of use that as a guide coat to tell yourself that you're sanding too far. If you sand into the gray, you want to stop. So I did that carefully, you know, just, you know, you got to flip all your parts and all that good stuff. So it takes a little bit, but the epoxy actually dries, you know, as fast or faster than paint anyway. So I just put it on with a foam brush for this. Worked fine. And again, you can kind of see, it's got a slight transparency to it because maybe I didn't add enough gray, but it does a pretty good job hiding all the wood grain. So the inside, I want it to be a different color. I want it to be gold. So I added gold to the epoxy, gold dust. And I just painted it on like it was paint. Same thing as the outside with the gray, just did that with the gold. This way, when I use the gold paint later, I could, again, not have to hide as much wood grain and epoxy and all that stuff. It's like half done for you before you ever start painting. So the epoxy is kind of thick though, so it takes away a little of the definition. I wanted all that definition, so I took a piece of sandpaper and sanded some of that shape back into it because the epoxy has a lot of surface tension in it. It really fills up the shapes a little bit, so which is good because you don't want sharp corners when you start to paint. Like here I'm painting. This is Elixir. It is a water-based or water cleanup anyway finish. It's semi-transparent, so it's kind of like watercolor or something. It's kind of fun to use. Dries super fast, and it is very easy to clean up. It has low fumes and all that. It's actually really kind of fun to work with, but it is a little transparent, so you got to kind of play that in when you're doing it. It's not like latex house paint, but you can tint it however you want it, so that's kind of fun. I wanted little fake rivets, so I used 4-minute epoxy again to just glue those on. There I've done brown primer on the outside of the box over the gray, the primer being epoxy again, not really primer. So that way when I come through with my paint, which I'm doing there, it's, pre-primed. So the paint there is, again, Elixir. You can get it in the primary colors in black and white, and I just mixed up a gray from black and white and made sure to mix enough for the whole thing, so I knew I wouldn't have to color match myself, and went for it. Couple coats, and it starts to cover and fill and all that good stuff. You can sand any little bubbles or anything that you have, and it starts looking pretty good pretty fast. So at this point, I think I liked it, and I was ready to make it kind of glitter. So I added gold dust again to Halcyon varnish. It's a water-based varnish that plays well with the Elixir paint. Again, water cleanup, low VOC. It's dries nice and hard. It's pretty easy to work with, and it's sort of thin, so it's transparent, and it's nice. So I added a little gold to that and then just coated the whole box. So now it has kind of a glitter coat to it. Here I just took some cheap hardware store hinges and tweaked them until they were the right shape for the curved top. One leaf has to be curved, the other one's straight, and it's easy. You know, you just take your time and take the piece back and forth to the cooler and just make sure that it sits down there nicely so it doesn't look silly when you go to screw it down. And there you can see the glitter. And there, it's done. It worked awesome. I stuck a piece of sticky back weather stripping in the lip, between the lid and the lip. Works awesome. I wanted to thank TotalBoat for all the foam and glue and paint and all the cool stuff. And thank you for watching.